So let's get started. I'm going to shut off my video again. Greetings, everyone. And we'll get started. So let's talk about what do you think of when you hear the term low morale? So Kelly, as folks type in those comments, would you let me know some of the responses, please? What do you guys think of when you hear the term low morale? And I'll give you like a couple of moments to think about that.
Unhappy coworkers, apathy, burnout, feeling, wow, you guys are quick. Underappreciation, woo, this is a good topic.
Wow.
Negative energy, lack of enthusiasm, low motivation, don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Wow.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. And I know we have folks in here, so just keep it coming. Also, another thing, too, is even though I can't see your comments in real time, please, 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 I see this as a dialogue. So put in your questions, and whatever I don't get to today, know that I will respond after today's discussion. I do see this as a dialogue. I can't stress to you how much that means to me. So today what we're going to talk about, I'm going to review the low morale study, the background of the study. I'm also going to be talking with you about tracing the development and impact of the low morale experience. I'm hoping that some of you have had an opportunity to read the study and are a little bit familiar with this. So I'm not going to get in depth because we have a limited amount of time, but I will trace that development and impact of the experience. And then we'll quickly review systems or factors that enable low morale experiences in academic library environments. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, I'd really like to have an ongoing discussion with anyone within this forum or outside of this forum. I see this as a topic that is longstanding and has, unfortunately, has longevity, but something that apparently is very a flashpoint for folks working in these environments. When I began this study, what I thought I would read about are some of the things that everyone mentioned as I asked you, what do you think of low morale? Think ideas, negative feelings concerning issues of respect in the workplace, recognition of contributions and accomplishments in your workplace. Perhaps there are concerns about work-life balance. Things are out of balance and they are that unbalance is supported or encouraged in the workplace. There might be some unclear work expectations. What am I supposed to be doing? What is my role? That might not be clear for folks. Poor leadership, poor communication, and also structural changes and related outcomes, so attrition, layoff. These are the things that we consider and people go to quickly, and the literature, in fact, discusses when we think of low morale. And so when I approached this study, that's what I thought I would be hearing about when I approached it. So my focus was on credentialed academic librarians, those working in academic library environments. I was also motivated by issues of collegiality, ethics, professionalism. These are topics that I've been interested in historically as I moved throughout my career as a scholar. And I'm also interested in workplace culture and organizational behavior, leadership training, professional development, and then this continuing thread of the emotional labor of librarianship, how that might play into this phenomenon. So one question that I had was, what does it feel like or mean to have low morale within the environmental and social context of academic librarianship? So when I was thinking about the original idea of the study, I started looking at literature about job satisfaction, burnout. Somebody mentioned that, as a matter of fact, when I asked just a few moments ago, what do you think of? You mentioned burnout. I also looked at issues of career mobility and professional development and leadership. What I found after I talked with my participants is that low morale is the result of repeated and protracted exposure to verbal, written, systemic abuse and negligence in the workplace. I was really, really surprised to come to this definition, but that is what 21 people told me. So then I had to go back. So this is a phenomenological study. So I had to go back and find literature discussing issues of workplace incivility, workplace toxicity, bullying, mobbing. Burnout was the common theme between what I expected and what I received. And then this isn't in my study, but it came out after the study. Babazi et al.'s idea or concept of vocational awe, which she defines as the idea that libraries as institutions are inherently good. It assumes that some or all core aspects of the profession are beyond critique, and it in turn underpins many librarians' sense of identity and emotional investment in the profession. So I'll tell you a little bit about my participants. I had a purposive sample from 3 listservs. I contacted my participant pool, or the potential participant pool, through the university library, college libraries, and new members roundtable. I wanted to get as broad a range as possible. Within one day, I had a waiting list of over 50. So I took the first 20 folks who were able to who were able to agree with the informed consent, and then we had 20 interviews. So I interviewed 21 people. One person dropped out, so I ended up analyzing 20 transcripts. So the analysis of the transcripts means that when I analyze for using the phenomenological method, I read these transcripts several times, and then I take out what I perceive are significant statements, and then I have to categorize those significant statements, and then I create meanings for those statements, and then I write up a report on those based on those most common categories. And that's how you see the themes that come out of this study. Going back to the participants, they were the reflection of the general LIS workforce in that they were mostly Caucasian women who had at least a decade or more of experience, and they were middle-aged. So while there was a small group of participants, they were reflective of the general workforce. So I just mentioned to you that I applied a qualitative method called the phenomenological method, and I always mess that up. You guys say it, and maybe you'll mess it up too, maybe, or not. Yay if you don't. So it's a qualitative method, and I supported that method with open coding. So I used common language to validate the language of the participants. And then I used ongoing validation, which is just a negotiation between me and the participant of, is this what you mean when you said this word? If you didn't mean that, what do you mean? For instance, when you say, I'm depressed, is this what you mean? Tell me get as granular as you can to tell me what depressed means for you. I think when I wrote it up, I said it this way. Is this what you meant? So I'm trying to get down to the universal essence, as Creswell discusses in his book, which I cited at the below here. I'm trying to get to a universal essence, and that universal essence, in this case, for the experience of low morale in academic librarians, brought me to 12 common themes. Thank you. So the first thing is, the first 3 themes deal with the trigger event. Now, people will ask me, well, what's the point of the trigger event? Well, it's different because a lot of people think, oh, that was just a bad day. No one mentioned their trigger event as just being part of a bad day. It was unexpected. They related that trigger event throughout the experience, even if something else happened within the development. Other events occurred, they perceived that event as the beginning of the end, as it were. It's unexpected. Usually they were brought into a meeting that they didn't expect, but actually they were going into their regular meeting. It's like a regular meeting that they usually have, or a regular discussion with the person that they usually see, and then something happens. And they perceive it then, from then on, as this is when the abuse happened. And I use the terms low morale and workplace abuse interchangeably, considering the definition. So for me, this is when my cycle of workplace abuse happened. That's the point of the trigger event. And there's a definitive response to the trigger event. Anger, there's the emotional response, which is anger, shock, surprise, iterations of anger, everything from irritation and annoyance all the way up to I want to punch something, sort of anger. And then that's also associated with feelings of betrayal, shock, surprise, confusion. Why is this happening? What did I do? And then a little bit of self-blame within that anger. And then the physical or physiological response is simply very simple: fight or flight. Increased heart rate, sweating, nervousness, and a desire to either confront or to get out of the situation. So if that feeling is familiar, flushing face, embarrassment, things like that, all those sorts of physiological markers of fight or flight. From there, and this is the difference. This is the marker of the trigger event. Something can happen and you just have an argument with your colleague, and the next day or a few moments you're fine. For the trigger event, it's different, because now you have protracted workplace abuse. So if you just had a bad day with your colleagues, it might not happen again, or the person might even come back and say, hey, yesterday when I snapped, I'm so sorry that happened, and it's done. But in this case, the trigger event is a marker that from here on out, abuse becomes regular. It escalates as time moves on. There's different types of abuse. Let's say if the trigger event was originally some sort of systemic abuse or verbal abuse, well, I'll say verbal abuse. That trigger event, someone says something mean to you. And then later on, you'll begin to be exposed to different types of workplace abuse. So remember, the 4 types are verbal, written, emotional, and systemic, and then also this point of negligence. So you might start to feel like you're being neglected. You might start being exposed to not only verbal abuse, but systemic abuse. So from there, you see these manifestations of other myriad responses, which then begin to affect your career and outlook. Everybody understand how these things are associated? I'm hoping that you guys are nodding. So those expand. Another thing is too, you start seeing cognitive responses. So whereas in just a trigger event, you see the flash of anger and then the fight or flight, you start getting more and more responses, physical responses, mental responses. And the low morale development is marked by cognitive responses. And that's where you see the effect on the LIS career and outlook come into play. Kelly, are there any questions popping up?
No, but a lot of really great comments. Stephanie talked about low morale due to double standards and discrimination. Harry had a really good question about anyone mentioned having multiple trigger events.
Yes, they do. So that's where the point, well, not multiple trigger events. The trigger event is the trigger event. Every time the trigger event is what started it all. So after that is just protracted abuse. So it's not another trigger event. It's just more abuse. That's the point of the low morale. They say this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then also this happened, all from this one person. And even if the offender changes, when I ask them and you say this started when, they'll go back to that original event. So that's the importance of the trigger event. I hope that answers your question. And the person who mentioned discrimination, I'm actually working on a follow-up study for, and I know discrimination happens in a myriad ways for different groups of people. However, I am working on a follow-up study focusing on minority, racial, ethnic librarians. So I'm working on that right now to see if there are any differences, what those differences are. So thanks for bringing that up. Any other comments?
Nodding was another example. Stephanie did, she also mentioned HIV, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And everyone's looking forward to your study.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking forward too. Does anybody want to help? Okay. All right.
Her contact information.
Always looking for co-authors. Okay. So let's talk about those short-term things. I'll talk a little bit more. I mentioned a little bit. So remember, we said that short-term effective and physiological response to just the trigger event. But then there are these long-term effective physiological and cognitive responses. So when you're looking at someone said, are there multiple trigger events? No. What's happening is at the next time another event occurs, you feel the previous emotions. You remember how this all started, right? And now this is happening and you're responding to that. So it's a compounding of these emotions, right? And then so you have then we start seeing things like increased depression. And within that depression, what was interesting is people started talking in terms of the classic Greek grief cycle. So that classic grief cycle is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's classic grief. So you know the stages of grief, denial, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, things like that. And we know that the classic grief cycle is not linear. You can feel those emotions at the same time. You can go backwards and forwards within the cycle. So imagine that experience within the depression of being, for another lack of a better, what it is, it's abuse. You're being abused, and you're depressed, and you're also grieving, because one of the points of this is that librarians were grieving the loss of a career or perception of the career. And I'll talk a little bit about that, where that grief is coming from. They were grieving the loss of their identity, the loss of what they felt librarianship could be. So that was very interesting and powerful. They also felt increased feelings of powerlessness, despair, apathy. They started speaking in terms of their career, in terms of, I feel stuck. I can't move forward in my career. I am disillusioned with librarianship, and I am experiencing anxiety because now I'm concerned about the effectiveness of my career. If I'm going to be able to be mobile in my career, how will my career develop? What barriers are now in my way? So that's the long-term effect of low morale. As I move through this too, I want to mention, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I'll stress this every time I talk about this study. I am in no way pleased at the interest, the amount of interest in this study. I find myself in a sort of conflict. So I do make a point to thank my participants for letting me know and letting people know what is going on in our profession. I'm happy that I am giving a name to it, but I want to stress that I am in no way, like, yay, this is happening, and yay. So I want to acknowledge the participants' role in this, and also acknowledge that this is an area of conflict for researchers, well, for me anyway. So there's that. So as we move forward to the low morale development, we move forward and seeing that now they're engaging in coping strategies. And I want to be clear in defining coping strategies. Coping strategies are unconscious or conscious behaviors. They're positive or negative. And we start seeing people engage in those strategies. So some people eat more. Some people stop doing their work. Some people steal time. Some people decide they're not going to be as helpful as maybe they could have if this weren't happening to them. Some people self-harm. And one person mentioned that they, wanted to self-harm. So their coping strategies are positive and negative, conscious or unconscious. Okay. And then they begin efforts to mitigate. Mitigating methods are different from coping strategies, because coping strategies focus on what the victim is doing to feel like they have control over this phenomenon. Mitigation methods are methods that they engage in to try to stop the abuse at work through formal or informal challenges. So a mitigation method would be, I went to HR. Another mitigation method would be, I started documenting. A mitigation method would be, I look for another job. I sued someone, So these are mitigation methods. They're trying to directly affect the abuser or the system of abuse, or the systems that are enabling the abuse. They're trying to engage with those systems to stop it and resolve it. But then there are long-term effects anyway, because once you're in the low morale experience, it's one thing about the low morale experience, it is that it is insidious. It is extremely slow developing. So it takes people a while to realize that they're being abused, because as librarians, and I'm going to take it back to the vocational awe, one of the ideas we have about librarianship outside of value is how we perceive our colleagues, right? We say, all librarians are nice. Librarians are nice people. We believe that about ourselves. We're nice. No one will ever treat me meanly because we're librarians. We're nice people. But this clearly shows we have some not nice people. And more clearly, most of the time, the not nice people are people who are our administrators. A lot of the people mentioned that this abuse was coming from people who are their leaders. So not to put everybody in a bowl, however, most of the abuse comes from people who are over others. So we keep that in mind. So these long-term effects are in part because it takes a long time to even realize that you're in the situation. And really, quite frankly, until now, I'm not sure people were thinking, oh, I have low morale because I'm being abused. They weren't even calling it that. So that's part of that as well. Any questions at this time or comments?
Yeah, April had a great question. She asked, is it possible to fix morale without leaving?
Well, I haven't heard of anyone doing it. Yeah, you can. If that mitigation method will usually mean that someone has to leave. So it depends on where the abuse is coming from. Is it systemic? Is it on your campus? Is it in your library? Is it both? And it depends on what leverage you have to get rid of the source of the abuse without leaving.
Another question was from Carrie. Did anyone mention abuse that was not from higher ups?
Well, yes, because one of the things is so if you, in the study, we talk about this thing called relational aggression. Relational aggression is the scholarly term for mean girls. And so a lot of people talked about this mean girls function. However, even within that, it was being instigated or encouraged or at least not stopped by administration. But there was this aspect of relational aggression / mean girls. So in that case, you see some collegial or peer-to-peer abuse.
And one more question from Matt. Did participants speak about persistent and systematic underfunding as a cause for low morale?
No, most of the things were abuse. Now, the undercut of that is the abuse was being caused or how can I say? So one of the problems with abuse is so we talk about systemic abuse, right? So within systemic abuse, we have things like people being overworked because let's say you don't have a lot of staff in your library, and one of the ways your administrator abuses you is to make you work hours instead of advocating for the library for more staff. So if this person is, say, a person who uses favoritism as a weapon, they may have you work a lot. And you might say, oh, I feel like I can't call out. Or if you call out because you're ill, they force you to come in anyway, or they retaliate against you if you don't come stay in the library for, say, 12 hours or something like that. So issues of underfunding come to play in that way, where they're used as a weapon to abuse people working in the library. So these things are a lot more interconnected than they think, right? So we see how these things of lack of advocacy, how important it is to advocate for the library, how important it is to have leaders advocate effectively for the library, because if they're not, and they have the potential to become abusers, they are likely to use these issues of underfunding and other associated things what we consider are important for advocacy work in libraries. They will weaponize these as tools of abuse for people working in libraries. So that's that marker there, or link there. The impact of low morale on practice, and this is a high concern, outside of the abuse of learning that abuse is happening in our workplaces, which is the highest priority to reduce and completely eradicate if possible. The other concern is what happens to our colleagues when they practice, considering the importance of the practice of librarianship in our communities and in our campuses. So reduce collegiality. So abuse begets abuse. And it may not be the same type of abuse being perpetuated on you, but if you have reduced collegiality, you might be perceived as this person is rude to me, snappy with me. So that, of course, breeds more, ideas of workplace incivility. There's reduced engagement with professional development and continuing education, which means we're not able to do our jobs as effectively as we could if we were up on the latest things, issues, concerns, services, technologies, so on and so forth. Reduce productivity. If you're in academic libraries, the game of the day is productivity. So if it's reduced, what does that mean for your career moving forward, particularly in areas where, promotion and tenure or tenure track is an issue, or even continuing appointment? And then also for your own self-esteem. We know that work is a part of self-esteem. And if you're coming to work and not being able to do your work to your level, that is a self-esteem issue that could go outside of the library. As I mentioned earlier as well, there's these increased instances of unethical work behaviors. As professionals, what we have at the end of the day is our ethical obligation, which means that's the only thing that keeps the trust, public trust, our user trust, is how well we adhere to our code of ethics. How closely are we adhering to them? However grand they are, however nebulous they are, we have them. And if we're not ethical, we're going to have a problem with our public trust. So I heard things like, I stopped. One person said, I think in the study, I would take 3-hour lunches. I would sit at my desk and eat my lunch. But then after I ate my lunch, I would just do whatever I wanted and not do my work. Or someone said, I kept coming in late. I would come in late and I knew I was coming in late and whatever. So that means someone else has to stay and cover your shift, or someone else has to do your work, and it might not be done as well if you're doing it. And this is particularly true in, say, a small library. I can see how that really, really becomes a true problem in a smaller library where, John's not doing his work and I have to do some, things to have to get done. There's increased negative feelings about the profession. Should I stay here? Is this what librarianship really is? Why am I in here? And I think about this also in the context of librarianship is generally a second career for a lot of people. And so they can easily return to another field if they want to. And so people started thinking about, why am I doing this? I could be doing something else. I could return to my yoga classes that I was teaching. I could go back and be a teacher or do something else. I have a second master's degree in something else. I don't have to stay here. And as a matter of fact, I think I'm going to leave. I think I'm going to leave. And that's that desire to leave the field begins, and they begin looking for other work. But within that desire, I do want to mention librarians had an emotional conflict about leaving. Librarians love their job. And all the studies I've ever talked to librarians about why they're librarians, we love our field. However, when it came to low morale, they wanted to stay, but they did not want, nobody wants to be abused. So that makes sense, right? They want to stay. They see if you can just let me do my job. If you would just leave me alone and let me do my job, that would be really great, because I really like my job. I really can see that I'm helping the students. I really can see that the systems librarian work I'm doing is helpful. I can really see this catalog work that I'm doing, this open source thing that I want to try out is going to be so amazing, but I can't do it because you're bothering me. So there was an emotional conflict. People don't want to leave. They don't, but they will. So the last 3 items are the recovery. So we have the recovery, the morale lessons, what they learn from this experience, and then impact factors on low morale. Low morale recovery is long and arduous, and there is sometimes no end, most likely. But people learn from this experience. Most importantly, they learn how to be better leaders. Even if they were already leading in some capacity, they've learned how to be better leaders, how to be even more compassionate, how to be to ensure humane treatment of humanity. Empathy is a hallmark of their management philosophy. And they want people to know that their accomplishments are valued. They realize that people need to feel valued. And so they take those things away. So basically they learn how not to be horrible people, less horrible, or, whatever. The horribleness goes down. And in fact, some people say, I now have a zero tolerance. They use the word zero tolerance for any sort of maltreatment of anybody in their charge, under their management, in their library. And they're more likely to call abuse out more quickly as well. Their impact factors on low morale, we'll talk about those here. So more quickly about recovery. Again, not guaranteed. If you're going through low morale, you can expect that you will have some essence of that experience with you for quite some time. And these are some of the ways it may manifest. Sustained impact on mental and physical health. People, even after experiencing the event, They go to therapy. They started going to therapy, and a lot of people mentioned during that time, even if they said they had left that particular environment, they were still in therapy, managing and parsing out that process. If they had issues, if they coped by, say, gaining weight or losing weight or developing chronic conditions like hypertension, like diabetes, they might have migraines. They still have those things because those things take a while to, particularly once you get something like, say, hypertension, you have to do a lot to get off of those medicines. So those are long-term, like a chronic condition. There's a sustained impact on professional confidence because one of the markers of emotional abuse was micromanaging. And so they felt like even when they were given autonomy in their new positions, they didn't trust the autonomy. They didn't trust it at all. They had sustained impact on collegial administrators because once a skeptic, now when they go to their new positions, or even if they stay there, whatever a colleague or administration tells them, they do not believe it. It takes a long time to trust colleagues and trust leadership. And again, they have this obligation to root out dysfunction or abuse. So while they're looking for positions, if they decide they're going to look, they do whatever they can to root out signs of dysfunction in a new workplace, or say during the interview, or signs of abuse during the interview. They're really working hard to not jump from the frying pan to the fire here. And again, they have this humane leadership commitment. I want to talk to you a little bit about enabling systems, and Matt kind of mentioned this a little bit in terms of, what are these other situations that might be going on that might be helping low morale develop, persist, fester. Faculty status, tenure and promotion, human resources limitations, leadership. And there are others, but these are the ones I'm going to focus on today. Before I move forward, are there any questions or comments so far I should address?
So Salone has a really great question. How do you root out abuse in an interview?
Hey, you guys, this is an opportunity for you. That's what I'm looking forward to hearing these strategies. Since this wasn't a part of it, I didn't really get into detail about it. But I like to know. So if anyone is willing to share some strategies, how they root it out, that'd be useful. Any other questions or comments?
So Sally asks, were there any characteristics of abusive institutions, for example, larger versus small libraries, state versus private?
No. So one thing I can say is be aware of, one thing I can say is this: if there's a way for you to ask the question of how long has how many administrators has the library had in, say, the last 5 years? Not that this is marker, but if, like, it's been 2 or 3, something's going on there. Why is this position being filled? Things like that. There was no indication that this is happens a lot more on larger institutions versus smaller institutions. This is a problem of organizational stability, leadership preparation, and also, I think, to a certain degree, perceptions of librarians and libraries and the role and the confusion about the role of librarians and libraries on academic campuses as well.
So Amy asks, are there ways to truly address and resolve issues with HR limitations?
Well, because there are laws, too many laws in different states, I don't know. But one thing you can ask is, I guess if you're having an interview and you talk with that human resources person, you could find out, like for instance, people that necessarily remember or realize, particularly if you're a faculty status, I think people forget that grievance procedures for faculty are totally separate from human resources. So say if a person abuses you and even if you call out the abuse, they still could stay because they have, in order for them to actually lose their position, it has to go through a grievance process under faculty organization. So some of these things are limited by academic processes, and they're not all just because human resources limitations are limitations in and of themselves. Sometimes our faculty status ties up human resources. So let's look forward to this faculty status. So first, I feel like it's really important to be frank and open about The challenges of faculty status. As a faculty person with faculty status myself, I think it's important, and I think even before I had faculty status at other institutions, I believe that faculty status is important for numerous reasons. However, there's some challenges to faculty status. Just the terminology that we use within this context can be problematic. So we use things like junior faculty and senior faculty. So if someone's senior over you, there's this interplay of intimidation or inherent intimidation. So I think it's very important that we not sidestep language that is used that promotes potentially problematic situations, okay? Within faculty status, there's this de facto acceptance of toxic behaviors and incivility. So even though we have these values saying we don't do this we say this on paper, de facto in our daily lives as, say, junior faculty or even senior faculty, we recognize that incivility and toxic behavior is kind of not really punished in our spaces of academia. And I just like to get I don't think I'm wrong here. I like to know if you can vote or raise your hand. Is this something that I'm alone in thinking about or have witnessed or observed? And I've been on many campuses. I think it's important that we mention this and say this.
No, you are not alone.
Okay, just checking. You guys, I can't see you. I'm sorry. But I really
resounding, you are not alone.
Okay, resounding. I hear the silent yeses. Okay. I think it's really important to say that, because one of the things that people say, well, you watch it, you see it, but everybody's afraid to say something to the person who's been here 20 years, right? Everybody's afraid to say something, like if I were on me having just received tenure at my institution, I perceive that if I were at a larger institution where there were a lot more junior faculty than me, I would probably perceive differently on July 1 and I was received on June 30, okay? Just saying. Even if my personality doesn't change, people may start treating me differently, or if I decided I was going to say something. And you also hear statements like, I can't wait till I get tenure so I can say blah, blah, blah. So this idea of this de facto acceptance of you can say what you want now that you have tenure, you can do what you want now that you have tenure. And that plays into this thing where now I can do what I want, right? And again, I mentioned too, this separate and conflicting grievance procedures between what human resources says you do in cases of abuse, and then what happens in the faculty manual. And does your faculty manual cover instances of abuse? Probably not. So maybe that's something you can consider if you're on faculty organization, adding to your documentation. Okay. And then there's this converse thing about being tenured into a corner. So you get tenure and now you feel like you can't leave because the benefits of tenure will place you out of the market, right? So that's this cornering situation. And people talked about that as well. Like, I would leave, but I'm like, I got things I got to do, and I'm at this point in my career, and there's no way I'm going to match that point in my career. If I leave now, it's better to just take it and just see if I can retire or just focus on the benefits that come with my tenure track status. Human resources limitations come more into play with staff librarians, so librarians who don't have faculty status. But then you start seeing things like inherent negligence. So if people are being abused by administrators or colleagues who've been there a long time, human resources may not be inclined to do anything for you because they don't want to deal with the long-term fallout of dealing with people who have historically abused people in the library or on campus. And then they're also concerned about, they don't report because they're concerned there'll be increased harassment. Because once you report abuse, human resources is obligated to meet with the abuser and then meet with you, and then the person's gonna know, and then they're gonna abuse me more. And instead of leaving, they're gonna be abusing me more in the library. So it's best that I just don't say anything. I'm not gonna say anything. But in fact, this is a I would say if you are in a situation where you don't feel like you can go to human resources, at least start documenting. At least start documenting, because there's this element of contagion that I talk about. And you are probably not the only person dealing with this person and experiencing abuse by this person. And usually people said they talk to others. That was very empowering. So if you're talking to other people and you find out that your colleague is also doing something, and usually you'll know, because one of the markers, one of the most popular ways that an abuser does their thing is they target people cyclically. So you might be the target one day and then they move on, and most people could even predict it, like she'll be back to me or he'll be back to me in like 4 weeks. So start writing that stuff down, because if everybody writes it down, when that complaint comes down, there's a fuller picture of what's going on that cannot be denied. So if you feel like you can't talk about it and tell it to human resources, write it down for yourselves. If you find out that your coworkers are also going through it, please have them write it down itself. And at some point, when it's time, you will have a fuller picture of what's happening in your space. So I think that's very powerful. So I'll say that about human resources limitations and one way to mitigate them. Finally, I want to talk about leadership. So I read this book by Miss Ortega called Academic and Libraries and Toxic Leadership. And this quote is right at the very beginning. You don't even have to go past, page 10, I think. Work cannot and should not be everything to librarians, because toxic leaders will abuse their dedication, and these dedicated librarians will in due course burn out. Work-focused lives seems to have, in some cases, unintentionally assisted toxic leaders with their exploitative behaviors. So see, an abuser will use your dedication. They know you want to be a quote unquote good librarian. Let's take it back to vocational all. To be a good librarian is to be in service all times, to serve everyone else at your own detriment even. And because we believe in that value as librarians, and we do that value often, that's why we have understaffed libraries, I think, because we just continue to do the work instead of saying, we're just gonna have to close. We're gonna have to close because we cannot do it. We will just make it work, right? We'll make it work. We'll do more with less. And what happens is a person who is an abuser will not advocate for the library, but sure will let you work those 56 hours or those, those 90 hours that the library is open. They sure will. So leadership, people who are in leadership who have the potential or desire or capacity to abuse will usually, once they realize that you are a dedicated, quote unquote, good librarian, will just roll with that, and that's how it flows from there. Of course, leadership that invokes these types of things is in a direct result of lack of professional development. They don't know how to be leaders. We know that a lot of librarians who are in leadership positions, or many may not have had formal training. They have moved up ranks. They might have been ushered into jobs. They might be really good at administrative things, but that doesn't mean they are good at working with people. So there's this idea that in libraries, that because you're an administrator, that means you're a leader, and I feel like we need to separate those things out. There needs to be professional development and leadership, and you really need to understand what your management style is, really how are you going to treat people, and what those outcomes from treating people are going to be. And I don't think that is necessarily a conversation that's happening in these areas of quote unquote administration when we talk about leadership. And then there's the introversion of the workforce. And we've heard this numerous times in librarianship, library literature. I don't think it's outside of the box to say that librarians are probably quote unquote introverts. And that means we're not going to be telling people a lot about what's happening, even though we might be thinking about it a lot. And the level of anxiety that people have as a result of these experiences lets me know that they're not saying it to others per se, except when they realize maybe someone says something else first. So it's just a lot of silence, basically, is what's happening, which is, I think, one of the reasons why this study has affected a lot of people so much, because people don't talk about it. Like, there's that thing, introverts unite together and unite separately in our own homes. Yeah. Okay. So there's this introversion that doesn't help us. Another thing I want to talk about too is this idea of job ushering, because as I was listening to my participants talk about it, I'm like, well, how is it that these abusive leaders continue to abuse? Well, one way is what I call job ushering. Job ushering, have you ever given somebody a great reference because you want them to leave? I'm guessing there might be some nodding there. Or have you heard of this? You give them a great reference so they get out of there, so you don't have to deal with them anymore. And so you shuffle them off to where they can now wreak havoc elsewhere. Job ushering. And then this idea also of vocational awe, how that plays into how leadership exploits and abuses. As you consider what I've shared with you today, I want you to think about this and understand some takeaways. First off, within this abuse cycle, when I was trying to figure out what was going on, what sorts of abuse, people didn't perceive negligence as a form of abuse. So abuse is being something negative being done to you, but negligence is something not being done for you. So lack of advocacy is negligence. When people don't respond to your concerns, that's negligence. When people do nothing or absent, negligence. Laissez-faire attitudes about what's going on in the library, negligence. And we might, as librarians, because we're in this unique section in campus, we get it from not only our library administrators, but also our campus administrators. But because negligence is misunderstood and perfidious, again, that's part of that slow moving process of the low morale experience. So it takes a while for people to realize, oh, hey, wait, this nice librarian is abusing me. And oh, this person, I didn't even realize that the person not doing anything for me is also compounding why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, this experience for me. Low morale effects are harmful. They are long-term, and they affect not only the person, but how they engage in their practice on a day-to-day basis and in their profession with other colleagues on campus and within the larger scope of how we do our work nationally, regionally, whatever areas you do your committees. You might stop doing your committees, those types of things. So it does affect our work. It is aided by de facto and de jure systems, and there are implications here for ethics, planning, as in succession planning and strategic planning, leadership, and the policies that we currently have in place that are probably not addressing specifically abuse in the workplace. And if they are, they're probably conflicting. At this point, my goal after writing the study is trying to identify and reduce the effects of this phenomenon. We have to figure out strategies. At this point, I invite you to share your concerns. I am taking all the time on an ongoing basis. Tell me your experience. You can tell me anonymously. Share your concerns about low morale. Is it happening at your institution? What's going on? Why might it be happening? And also share your strategies. If you've gone through low morale, how did you get out of it? What made it successful? What did you do? Did you change policies? How did you move about that process? I really, really like to know. And like I said, even though I couldn't see your comments in real time, I really, really see this as a discussion and an ongoing one, because people do have concerns about how do I get rid of it? How do we reduce it? And that can only come from the people who are experiencing it. That's all I have for the formal presentation.